Good evening. In the next few minutes, we will be talking about the historic relations of two key moments in history, the Spanish Civil War and the Second World War, both of which are represented in the novels of Soldados de Salamina and El Volga, nace en Europa, respectively.
We will start giving a brief but important introduction of these two books, which connect directly with the historic events of its time, and we will proceed to get into its relations. El Volga nace en Europa is divided in two parts. In the first one, Malaparte talks us about his experience in companion of a convoy of German armored vehicles during Operation Barbarossa, which watched the mobilization of the German army in Russian territory, moving towards important USSR cities. In the second part, he talks about the siege of Leningrad with the Finnish army. It is important to mention he also talked about how he saw the battle in the front lines and their habits. Operation Barbarossa started in 1941. In the first part, Malaparte talks us about their war machines, tanks, and how soldiers, more than soldiers, seem to be laborers, workers that without even noticing had changed the fabrics where they worked for the battlefield. Soldiers that were not soldiers by profession, but technicians and engineers, which only worry seemed to be their tank and armored convoy. This not only happened with Russians, but with Germans also. War at this point seemed to have lost its human sense. No direct contact was established with the enemy. Battles seemed to develop in long distance using artillery rounds or war machines, tanks, which were other factors that had an impact on Malaparte in this way. Explained as when they went through the place where combat was developed. They found no Russian bodies, and it looked like the dead by finishing the fight fled, leaving behind only the remains of battle. He talks about how the German advance through Russia seemed to be happening very fast, and German troops were not encountering as much resistance from the USSR as they first expected. Only small groups of Soviet combatants, small in number and scattered across the territory, were interposing them from their final objective, the city of Leningrad. He also explains how the Soviet people doesn't know how to react to the fact of not being under the communist regime anymore, and those that were over 40 years old and lived in Russia before the 1917 revolution occurred did remember how life was before the communist regime, and those who were younger didn't know what to feel facing this new situation that was unfolding in front of them. The second part of the book talks about the Leningrad siege, one of the bloodiest battles in history, and how the German and Finnish army would face off a battle of resistance against the Russian troops, which length would extend through years. Malaparte talks about the supernatural Russian resistance to hunger, cold, war, and suffering. He explains how the war changes through time, either for seasons that transforms lakes and rivers into battlefields, during winter, or the ceasefire happening at night. The Finnish army, which was perfectly adapted to the battlefield, communicating using nature, animal sounds, clever movements at the top of trees, or their ability to move in their skis, in small groups being powerful enough to defeat complete convoys. But even though they were in the front lines, they didn't lose their habits of sauna. During the whole extension of the book, the fact that the words "this chapter was suppressed by fascist censorship" or "the following lines were suppressed by fascist censorship" was common, and this leads me to think that those words were totally against what fascism believed, or talk about themes fascism had suppressed almost completely, such as art, individual thinking, or some books, as is in the case with this one, only in a greater measure.
I think the last part you're talking about is pretty important. The fact of having a fascist state where public opinion is suppressed makes an attempt of destroying the cultural and intellectual development of their citizens, therefore, of the critic and questioning itself. Ultimately, due to his being the fact that connects these two novels, of course, the tenet of political ideologies in which Javier Cercas relies on his book. The most important aspect to understand about Soldados de Salamina is that the book which is presented has a narrative and a storytelling of historic events, which facilitates the aspect of having an interesting narrative focusing on the characters with an historic background. The dates and how the book is written are really wide, due to the fact that it is trying to personificate Javier Cercas itself, working as a journalist inside the own narrative of his book. We are guided through history and an understanding about fascism, which is born as a reaction to communism and its warring or not historic expansion in the first half of the 20th century, where the necessity of the birth of the Falange Española, a political party in Spain which is based on fascist ideology. This creation took place in 1933. The creation itself of the party takes an example the widespreading and acceptation of Mussolini's Italian fascism in 1922. Here is when we begin the story connections of the book, where one of our first characters to appear is Rafael Sanchez Mazas, and we begin to hear about him through his son, Ferlosio, who talks about his history with Cercas. Sanchez Mazas is probably the most important character in the book, where he tells us his explosive history, writer, failed poet, co-founder of La Falange, history in which he tells us about the most intriguing fact, the fusillade of prisoners among which he stood, in which Sanchez Mazas was not touched by a single bullet. He was still alive. He escaped from under the dead bodies, and before he was free, a Republican militant saw him but never shot. Kindness, compassion, these are the book's interrogant in which its last part we are told that one person Cercas was interviewing to tell this history could have been the same militant that forgave his life that day. The importance of the book and how it connects to Cercas is of great importance. We understand that the past is only one dimension of the present, and this one, without the past, does not exist, because it is our history. Feelings of truth or hate are felt in the book. Hitler, Mussolini were trending in those years. The youngsters felt attracted to them, where Cercas comments that they should not be judged for falling in the front lines for them. This book defies the reader to have a critic version and revealing that each one of us have our own reality. And I quote Javier Cercas here, every good history are real, at least for one who is reading, which is the only one that matters. Close quote.
This is where we start an analysis and the historic connection of these novels. Fascism, created by Benito Mussolini and adopted by different historic characters, such as Francisco Franco or Hitler, whom pretended to control the industry and commerce by means of a totalist military state, in which all citizens had to be involved with militaries in the event of war, which generated a powerful nation capable of mobilizing millions to serve in the front lines.
Fascism sees democracy as an absolute way of ruling. This is why a totalitarian state must have a leader capable of defending this way of thinking, and generally, leaders of a fascist totalitarian state were the dictators that sold this idea to the people, make them believe that such regime was necessary in case of another large-scale military conflict develops.
And as I mentioned before, it was normal to fascist regimes to censor different things, such as theater, movies.
Press and literal. In this regard, we have the connection between both parts. At the end of the Spanish Civil War, censorship in the press presented itself at a large scale, creating laws that established publications in newspapers, where these had to publish exclusively what the government said and they needed to possess the same information.
And in El Volga, nace in Europa, with lines and chapters that were suppressed by the fascist regime, or which we have the knowledge because the author, Curcio Malaparte, insisted in mentioning the place in which they were supposed to appear. And we can see the kind of things the fascist regime of the Nazi Germany were suppressing in one of the chapters, suppressed in the first editions of the book that was published in later editions. It talked about a Russian artist, a painter, and it speaks about his house, a house full of art and extravagant customs of the artist. That led me to believe this was why it was censored in the first place. Fascism during General Francisco Franco dictatorships, better known as Francoist, has its basis on a nationalist state with an authoritarian dictatorship. The implicit importance of this period and or ideology is that after the defeat of the highest exponents of fascism, of the Axis potencies The Spanish dictatorship fell in comparison to its own best moment.
This may be due to the fact that the importance of the Axis nations as exponents of fascism and their military power gave a basis of the Franco's dictatorships, as Cercas mentions in his book. And I quote, Franco could use the Falange, with its rhetoric and rights and other outro-fascist manifestations, as a way of a tool to homologate his regime with Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy, from which whom so much help he had received, receives, and waited to receive. End quote. Thanks to this, we can now attribute a great part of the Phalange's coup d'etat against the Second Republic to Nazi Germany, which focused on lending its military power to the Spanish fascists to accomplish more than a victory over the Republicans, achieve a test ground for the armed forces of Hitler and a test field for the Second World War.